The moment the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, the world didn't flinch, but he didn't either. No anger, no confusion, not even curiosity. Daniel Rigg stood there in the fading light of a courthouse hallway, spine straight, jaw relaxed. His expression unmoved, as if he had seen this moment before in a dream and decided long ago not to resist it. The deputies didn't bark orders. They didn't need to. There was something in his stillness that swallowed noise. They put their hands on him like they were touching a memory too heavy to carry. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold halo on his weathered features. Creased skin, storm-gray eyes, a jaw hardened by silence more than time. He looked older than 66 and younger than regret. His boots were worn but polished. His shirt plain but tucked in. A man who hadn't forgotten the discipline that once carved him out of chaos. People nearby whispered, chuckled under their breath like it was some old man's stubborn pride on trial. One teenager pulled out his phone to film. A woman shook her head and muttered something about vets going off the rails. Nobody asked him what happened. Nobody really cared. They saw handcuffs and filled in the blanks with old clichés and lazy fear. The bailiff said his name. Daniel Rigg. He gave no answer. He didn't need to. That name hadn't belonged to him in years. Not since the desert, not since the blood, not since he buried half of himself in the sand beside men whose names no one remembered. As he was escorted into the courtroom, people turned. Not out of respect but curiosity. To them, he was just another ghost in government-issued metal, a fading echo of a forgotten war. But he walked like a man who had made peace with judgment. Not because he believed he was innocent, not because he felt guilt, but because there was nothing left to fight. No uniform to wear, no flag to carry. Just the long shadow of a duty that outlived its welcome. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't demand explanation. When they read him his rights, he blinked once. When they listed the charges, he looked straight ahead. There was no tremble in his hands, no heat in his voice, only the kind of quiet that made even the courtroom's fan seem too loud. The judge looked at him like she was trying to place him, trying to understand why this case felt heavier than paper could explain. And still he said nothing. He let the world talk over him, through him, around him. Because Daniel Rigg was a man who had learned that silence, when held long enough, becomes its own language. One that didn't beg to be heard, but demanded to be understood. And in that moment, cuffed and surrounded by people who only knew half of his story, he looked more free than any of them ever would. The murmurs began long before the trial. Not in any official sense. Not in the language of law or testimony, but in whispers shared over coffee, in the nods exchanged behind hands at church, in the knowing glances of neighbors who'd long decided what kind of man Daniel Rigg must be. No one had spoken to him in years, but everyone suddenly knew his mind. That's how it always began, not with evidence but with assumption. They called him unstable, off, a powder keg with a military past. One local article, written with the smug detachment of someone who'd never served a day in boots, referred to him as a disgruntled war relic. The radio host joked about him needing a therapy dog. Some folks laughed. Others just nodded grimly, convinced that the silence he carried like armor must be hiding something dangerous. The prosecutor fed on that air of mockery like it was oxygen. He smirked through his opening statement, painting Daniel as a volatile has-been, a man who thought his past gave him permission to menace strangers. He referred to the incident at the gas station with an almost theatrical scoff, emphasizing phrases like military threat and delusional intimidation. The words weren't designed to inform, they were meant to shame. Jurors glanced sideways at each other. A few raised their eyebrows at the mention of sniper rifles and war zones. A woman in the back whispered to her neighbor, "Isn't that the guy who lives by the woods? Doesn't even have internet. Creepy." Another muttered, "Probably PTSD. Probably sees enemies in trees." No one questioned the label. It was easier than asking why a man who once wore the nation's colors now lived alone, unheard and unclaimed, in a rusted trailer where even the flag in the window had faded. The gas station clerk took the stand and said Daniel had a military stare, as if resolve was now a crime. Another witness said he mumbled about knowing how to kill, as if the skill itself was scandalous, forgetting that someone once had asked him to learn exactly that. The so-called victim wore a neck brace like a badge of fragility, describing Daniel's quiet as if it were a scream. "He just looked at me, like he could end me. No threats, just that look." And the courtroom leaned in, feeding off the fear, mistaking stillness for malice. But Daniel, he sat unmoving, not defiant, not proud, just deeply, unbearably still. Because this theater of doubt and derision, was not new to him. It had followed him home from Fallujah, from Ramadi, from places most people couldn't pronounce. It echoed in every job interview that ended with a thank you but no call back. It spoke in every door that didn't open, every child pulled closer by a parent on the sidewalk. The world loved soldiers, until they stopped saluting. Then they were just broken men with strange eyes and forgotten birthdays. In that courtroom, mockery became its own verdict. Every smirk, every eye roll, every chuckle at the word sniper was a small conviction. But Daniel didn't flinch, because what they were mocking wasn't him. It was the cost of service. The price of carrying ghosts no one else wanted to see. And no one, not the prosecutor, not the press, not the townsfolk with their quick judgments and quicker gossip, none of them had the language to understand what it meant to outlive purpose. So he let them laugh. He let them sneer. He watched their theater with the same calm he once held in the chaos of war. Not because it didn't hurt, but because pain had long since become a familiar room in which he lived. And in that quiet, while others performed fear, Daniel Rigg remained a man, unbending, unspoken, and still. The story, at its surface, was almost laughably mundane. An ordinary scuffle at a gas station, a petty conflict twisted into a legal farce. Yet beneath that simple frame lay the weight of years unseen, of wounds unspoken, and a man misunderstood. It wasn't just about a parking spot, or a heated word exchanged in the cramped aisle of a convenience store. It was a collision of two worlds, the quiet, shadowed existence of Daniel Rigg, and the noisy, impatient modern life that neither welcomed nor forgave the ghosts who wandered through it. On the morning of the incident, Daniel had done what he always did. Walked his usual pre-dawn route, the cold air biting into his weathered face. His boots tracing the same silent paths worn down by years of solitude. He was a fixture of the neighborhood now, a ghost among the living, a man who rarely spoke but whose presence carried an unspoken gravity. To the young man who confronted him, Daniel was nothing but an obstacle, an old man who dared to hold space in a world too fast to care. The younger man's story was simple. Daniel had threatened him. The phrase military violence was tossed around like a buzzword, loaded with insinuation but lacking any real substance. It was as if Daniel's past, his service, his sacrifices, all reduced to a weapon aimed at a civilian with no cause. That single accusation was enough to drag him into the cold machinery of the law. A misdemeanor charge, they said, trivial enough to dismiss but serious enough to brand a man whose history no one wanted to hear. The courtroom became a stage for a trial far larger than the facts. It was a trial of perception, a battleground for respect long denied. Witnesses came forward with half-remembered details, each adding another layer of distortion. The gas station clerk spoke of Daniel's posture, too stiff, too deliberate, as if discipline was now suspicious. A woman claimed to have overheard muttered threats, her words vague but damning in the minds of those who already judged. And the man with the neck brace, the supposed victim, paraded his injury as proof. His testimony steeped more in performance than truth. But the heart of the case wasn't in the testimonies or the charges, it was in what the charges concealed. Daniel's silence was not surrender. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had fought battles no courtroom could understand. The weariness of a soul carrying the weight of decisions made in war zones where right and wrong blurred into survival. The silence was a shield against a world that no longer recognized him as a hero, only as a relic or a threat. This was a story lost in translation, between the language of war and the language of law. Between a man who had saved lives with a single bullet and a society that saw only the shadow of that act. As the trial wore on, it became clear that the true charge was not legal but moral, a reckoning with how we honor those who have given everything, and how quickly we turn away when the uniform is folded and the medals forgotten. And so, the case stood, a quiet indictment not just of Daniel Rigg, but of a system that failed to see the man behind the silence, a world that judged without knowing, and a truth that waited patiently in the stillness. The courtroom was heavy with an expectant silence, a silence that hung like a thick fog, swallowing every whispered word and restless shuffle. Daniel Rigg sat motionless, a living statue etched from years of solitude and unspoken battles. His eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the sterile walls. His silence was not mere absence of speech. It was a presence, a force that unsettled the air, making even the most confident observers hesitate. It was as if his stillness held the weight of unsaid stories, memories locked away behind a wall no one dared breach. Witness after witness tried to fill the void with their own versions of truth, but none could pierce that quiet fortress. When asked to respond, Daniel gave nothing. No defense, no explanation, no denial, just a steady, unmoving gaze that seemed to stretch time itself. To the casual onlooker, his silence might have seemed like guilt or defiance, but beneath that still surface was something far more profound. A man worn thin by years of being misunderstood, a man who had seen too much to waste breath on futile justifications. The silence spoke volumes, louder than any testimony or argument. It was the echo of distant gunfire, the hush after a mission completed, the pause before a breath taken in the cold dawn. It was exhaustion carved deep into bone and soul. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably in its presence. Even the judge found her pen tapping less confidently. The bailiffs glanced sideways, and the prosecutor's usual smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. No one knew what Daniel was thinking. Perhaps he was reliving moments when decisions meant life or death, when a single shot held the weight of 100 souls. Perhaps he was listening to a war only he could hear, or perhaps he was simply empty, stripped bare by time and sorrow. But that silence was not surrender. It was a testament to a man who had endured more than anyone in that room could imagine, and who had long ago given up fighting a world that refused to understand him. As the trial moved forward, Daniel's quiet became its own language, a language of grief, resilience, and an unspoken plea for recognition. It challenged everyone present to look beyond the surface, to question the easy judgments, and to confront the invisible wounds carried by those who never asked to be seen but so desperately need it. In that silence, Daniel Rigg was not a defendant. He was a mirror, reflecting back the fractures in a society that too often confuses noise for truth and words for understanding. And the deepest silence of all was the one waiting to be broken, not by Daniel, but by those who might finally hear. The courtroom air grew dense, heavy with anticipation and unspoken judgments as the prosecutor took the floor. His voice polished yet sharp, slicing through the quiet like a scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his tone carrying that practiced conviction of one who believed the truth was firmly on his side. "This man, Daniel Rigg, may have served once, but that was many years ago. Time has passed, but the dangers he poses have not." The words hung in the air, charged and weighted, a verdict pronounced before a single piece of evidence had been weighed. He painted a picture designed to ignite fear, to stir suspicion, a man clinging desperately to the ghosts of his past, wielding his military experience as a weapon to intimidate and threaten the innocent. "He believes his uniform still grants him power," the prosecutor asserted, eyes scanning the jury as if daring them to disagree. "But that is not heroism. That is menace, plain and simple." Nods rippled quietly among the jurors. Some faces looked away, others wore the faintest crease of doubt, but few questioned the narrative being laid before them. Yet across the room, Daniel sat unmoved, a fortress of stillness. He neither rose to defend himself nor showed any flicker of emotion. His silence was a cold mirror reflecting a story that no courtroom drama could capture, the loneliness of a man discarded by time, misunderstood by the very society he had once sworn to protect. To the prosecutor, that silence was guilt. To those who truly knew, it was the exhaustion of a soul worn raw by battles unseen. Testimonies were called, each one a brushstroke in a distorted portrait. A gas station clerk described Daniel's posture as aggressive, a silent accusation painted in body language. A woman swore she heard threats, her voice trembling between fear and certainty. The alleged victim, a man draped in a neck brace, painted Daniel as a living threat, recounting words purportedly uttered with cold menace. "I could end you from 800 yards without blinking." The courtroom shifted at those words. An echo of distant war, now twisted into intimidation on civilian soil. But no one asked what lay beneath those words. No one sought the truth behind the silence. The judge, a figure caught between duty and doubt, gave instructions, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. The jury filed out, the moment suspended between accusation and judgment. Outside the courtroom, a quiet stir began, a black SUV gliding to a stop, unnoticed except by a few who felt the weight of history entering the room. The arrival of General Samuel Wyatt, a 4-star sentinel of honor and memory, would soon rewrite the story unfolding within these walls. For Daniel Rigg was not just a man accused. He was a living testament to courage and sacrifice, a ghost from a past many wanted to forget, but one that demanded to be remembered. In that charged silence before the jury's verdict, the courtroom held its breath, not just for justice, but for the truth that only time and courage could reveal. The courtroom's murmur stilled abruptly as the heavy doors at the back swung open with a quiet authority, and the figure who entered seemed to command the very air itself. General Samuel Wyatt moved with a gravity that transcended rank or ceremony, a presence shaped by decades of battles fought not just on foreign soil, but within the hearts of men. The uniform he wore was immaculate, the 4 silver stars on his shoulders gleaming like beacons in the sterile light, but it was not the medals or the fabric that drew every eye. It was the weight of history, of unspoken respect, that filled the room with an almost sacred silence. No one asked for his credentials or questioned his authority. The court clerk straightened as if recalling a forgotten ritual, and the judge, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, paused her proceedings. The journalists in the back whispered, cameras clicking in hushed bursts, capturing a moment that already felt monumental. General Wyatt did not pause to speak or explain. He simply walked with deliberate steps straight toward Daniel Rigg. Their eyes met, and in that instant, decades of silence and sacrifice spoke louder than any courtroom testimony ever could. Daniel, who had sat motionless like a ghost throughout the trial, finally looked up, not with defiance or anger, but with something quieter, deeper, recognition. No words were exchanged, no handshakes or salutes. Instead, there was a solemn understanding, a communion born of shared trials and unyielding loyalty. General Wyatt's voice, when he finally broke the silence, was steady but imbued with a raw sincerity that rippled through every soul present. "I am here because this man sitting before you," he said, gesturing toward Daniel, "is the reason I am alive." The room seemed to hold its breath as the weight of those words settled. He spoke of a time 31 years ago, amid the chaos of Fallujah, when a sniper's unerring precision saved his team from certain death. 12 targets in under 5 minutes, each shot surgical, the final, impossible shot from 936 yards away cutting through the smoke and crosswind to carve a path to survival. As General Wyatt recounted the story, the courtroom transformed from a place of judgment to a sanctuary of reverence. The prosecutor's confident mask cracked. The jurors leaned forward, captivated by a truth far more profound than any testimony could convey. The narrative shifted from suspicion to awe, from accusation to honor. Wyatt spoke not just of military valor but of a man's quiet endurance, the invisible scars born long after the battle ceased. When the general offered to address the jury directly, his request was met with a nod of reluctant permission. His words cut through the haze of doubt and fear. "Whatever words this man may have spoken in a moment of frustration," he said softly, "do not overshadow the lifetime of courage and sacrifice he embodies. Men like Daniel Rigg are not threats, they are shields. They do not seek recognition, but they deserve remembrance." Then, in a gesture that stunned everyone into silence, General Wyatt dropped to one knee, not in ceremony but in apology. An apology for a man who had never asked for one, For a hero shackled not by the enemy but by misunderstanding and neglect. The image etched itself into the minds of all present. A 4-star general kneeling before a silent warrior, bridging decades of silence with a single act of profound respect. The judge's gavel fell, breaking the stillness as she dismissed all charges. Chains were removed, and a wave of quiet relief swept through the courtroom. Daniel Rigg rose, not with triumph, but with a quiet dignity long denied. Veterans standing outside saluted, and Daniel, free at last, carried the weight of history with the steadiness of a man who had never sought to be a hero, only to be understood. That day justice was not loud or easy. It was slow, painful, and deeply human. It was a testament to the power of truth, the necessity of honor, and the silent bravery of a man who never asked for praise but earned it all the same. When General Samuel Wyatt turned to face the jury, the room seemed to contract, as if every breath held was suspended in reverence. His voice, though calm and measured, carried the weight of a lifetime etched in battle and loss. "I have read the case files," he began, eyes steady, scanning the faces before him, "and I have listened to the accusations laid against Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rigg. But I tell you this, none of these words capture the truth of the man before you." His words hung in the air, not pleading, not defensive, but firm, resolute. He spoke not as a man seeking to persuade with rhetoric, but as one who bore witness to a reality few could fathom. "This man saved my life. 31 years ago, in the rubble and blood of Fallujah, when all hope seemed lost, Daniel was the sniper who opened a path for my team. 12 shots, 12 precise strikes in under 5 minutes. The last, an impossible shot at 936 yards, through crosswinds and chaos, was the difference between life and death." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his testimony settling like a stone in every heart. Reporters shifted, pens poised to capture the gravity, while jurors exchanged glances tinged with disbelief and awe. Wyatt's gaze softened, and a quiet vulnerability crept into his tone. He never asked for thanks, never sought recognition. He returned home, like many veterans, to silence and misunderstanding. The scars he carries are not only on his body but in the way he has been forgotten by those he once protected. His words pierced through the walls of prejudice and doubt, exposing the raw injustice inflicted upon a man who had given everything. With deliberate calm, the general addressed the jury directly. "I know what you've heard, the threats, the anger, the rumors. But I ask you to look beyond those surface shadows. This is a man tired of being misread, tired of being silent when silence has been mistaken for menace. In moments of chaos, when the world is breaking apart, you pray for a man like Daniel Rigg to be near. He doesn't wear his heroism on his sleeve. It is etched in every quiet step he takes." His voice softened to a near whisper, as if sharing a sacred truth. Men like him do not belong in chains. They belong in the history books. The impact of his testimony was palpable. It was as if the courtroom itself had shifted its axis, tilting towards a deeper justice that transcended the narrow confines of law and hearsay. The prosecutor's confident veneer faltered, his smirk replaced by a pale unease. The judge, moved beyond protocol, waited for the next moment that would redefine everything. In that charged silence, General Wyatt's words were more than testimony. They were a reckoning, a call to see the man, not the accusation, to honor sacrifice, not suspicion, to remember that true courage often speaks in the quietest of voices, waiting for someone to listen. The courtroom hung in a fragile silence, every eye fixed on General Wyatt as he slowly lowered himself to one knee before Daniel Rigg. The act was simple, almost understated, but the weight it carried was immeasurable, a gesture that transcended formalities and legalities, reaching into the deepest wells of human respect and humility. No grand speeches accompanied the motion, no dramatic flourishes, just a profound apology embodied in the unspoken language of reverence. This was not a show for the court or the press. It was a raw, unvarnished moment between two men who had borne the unbearable and survived. Daniel's stillness softened, his shoulders relaxing as if a decades-long burden had been gently lifted, if only for a moment. The eyes that had stared forward with a ghostly detachment finally flickered with the faintest spark of recognition, not for the courtroom crowd, but for the man kneeling before him. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared history, sacrifice, and the unseen wounds that time could never fully heal. The judge's hand trembled as she gripped her gavel, the weight of what she was witnessing settling over her like a sudden tide. Cameras clicked in hushed bursts, capturing a scene that defied the usual narratives of justice and punishment. The jurors, still seated in stunned silence, were visibly shaken, not by legal arguments, but by the raw humanity laid bare before them. In that moment, the lines between hero and defendant blurred, revealing a deeper truth about valor, vulnerability, and the cost of forgotten wars. As General Wyatt rose, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the tension easing like a storm finally spent. The judge's voice, steady but soft, broke the silence. In light of the extraordinary testimony and circumstances, I hereby dismiss all charges against Daniel Rigg, she declared. The sound of the gavel echoed not as a final judgment, but as a release, a liberation from years of misunderstanding and neglect. The cuffs fell away with a quiet clang, and Daniel stood, not with triumph or defiance, but with a dignity that had long been buried beneath layers of silence and pain. Outside the courtroom, veterans stood at attention, their salute a silent chorus of honor and respect. Daniel did not speak. He did not need to. His freedom was not merely from the courtroom, it was from the invisible chains of being unseen, unheard, and unrecognized. This moment, so charged with emotion and meaning, redefined justice, not as punishment but as redemption. It was a solemn reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of courage go unnoticed until someone dares to remember. And in remembering, they give voice to those who have long been silent. The courtroom's heavy air seemed to lighten as the judge's gavel struck the bench, a sound sharp yet oddly gentle, like the final exhale after a long-held breath. The dismissal of charges against Daniel Rigg was more than a legal verdict. It was a symbolic act of justice reaching beyond paper and procedure, a healing balm for a man who had carried invisible wounds far deeper than any accusation could suggest. In that moment, the silence that had once filled the room with suspicion transformed into a quiet reverence, an unspoken acknowledgement of a truth long denied. Daniel stood slowly, his movements deliberate but unburdened. There was no triumphant roar, no bitter defiance, only a calm steadiness that spoke of a soul finally at rest. For years, he had been seen through the fractured lens of misunderstanding, a ghost haunted by his own past and the world's indifference. Now, as the shackles fell away, so too did the weight of judgment, allowing a fragile sense of freedom to settle in his chest like a tentative sunrise. Outside the courtroom, the world awaited, yet something fundamental had shifted. Veterans who had stood silently in the shadows now stepped forward, their salutes a solemn tribute not only to Daniel but to every soldier forgotten, every story untold. They understood that this moment was not merely about clearing a name but about reclaiming honor, about restoring dignity to a man who never asked for praise but deserved it all the same. In the crowd, reporters lowered their cameras, the usual frenzy replaced by a profound stillness. This was not a spectacle but a revelation, a reminder that justice must be more than swift verdicts or hollow words. It must be rooted in truth and compassion. The four-star general's presence had pierced the veil of skepticism, illuminating the complex humanity behind the uniform and the silence that often followed it. Daniel's gaze met that of the general one last time, a silent conversation passing between them, a mixture of gratitude, understanding, and the quiet acknowledgement of battles fought far beyond the battlefield. The weight of years seemed to lift from Daniel's shoulders, replaced by something softer yet stronger: peace. He walked away from the courtroom not as a man defeated by circumstance, but as one redeemed by the courage of others to see beyond prejudice, to hear beyond silence. The world outside would never fully know the cost of his sacrifices, but in this moment, the invisible scars began to fade, replaced by a hope that the past would no longer define him, and that his story would finally be told with the honor it deserved. Justice had been served, not loud or easy but right. And for Daniel Rigg, it was a long-awaited breath of freedom, a reclaiming of identity, and a quiet victory that echoed far beyond the walls of that small-town courtroom. In the aftermath of the courtroom's upheaval, when the cameras finally dimmed and the crowds dispersed like morning mist, Daniel Rigg returned to the quiet solitude that had long been his refuge. There were no parades, no grand celebrations, no banners heralding a hero's return, just the steady rhythm of his footsteps against cracked pavement, the same worn boots tracing familiar paths through a world that had often seemed indifferent. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet existence, a profound shift had taken root. It was not the boisterous recognition of a public spectacle but a subtle, enduring acknowledgement, the kind that does not demand applause but quietly honors the soul. Neighbors who had once whispered behind curtains now offered nods of respect, small gestures laden with unspoken understanding. Veterans crossed paths with him and exchanged brief, knowing glances, silent salutes to the battles shared and the burdens carried alone. In those moments, Daniel felt a fragile thread of connection weaving through the fabric of his isolation, a reminder that though the world often overlooks the silent sacrifices, they are never truly forgotten. The weight of years spent misunderstood, labeled, and dismissed did not vanish overnight. It lingered, a shadow etched deep in the folds of memory and flesh. Yet, the apology rendered by a 4-star general in a courtroom far from the glare of fame had planted a seed, one that blossomed into a quiet redemption. It was a testament to the power of recognition, not as spectacle, but as an intimate act of humanity. In the solitude of his home, Daniel touched the faded flag pinned to his wall, the emblem of a life defined by duty and sacrifice. His eyes, once distant and guarded, now held a trace of something softer: peace. The recognition he had never sought had arrived not in loud declarations, but in the respectful nods of those who understood the invisible wounds carried by warriors. It was in the stories shared between old friends, the silent camaraderie at dawn's early light, the unspoken promise that his sacrifices mattered, even if the world at large remained unaware. This silent recognition, fragile and profound, was perhaps the truest form of honor. It did not seek to rewrite history or demand the spotlight. Instead, it nestled quietly in the hearts of those who had witnessed his courage and resilience, a gentle affirmation that a hero's worth is measured not by medals or headlines but by the lives touched and the battles endured in silence. Daniel Rigg, the man who once stood shackled and unseen, now walked a path illuminated by a humble truth: that sometimes the deepest respect is given not in noise and ceremony, but in the quiet moments when someone finally remembers and honors a sacrifice made without ever asking for anything in return.